Just lately with two movies that came out a couple of years ago was Midway, and the second one was Dauntless, the Battle for Midway, which is sort of a low-key movie which centered around the survival of two pilots that got shot down, and it actually showed very clearly the capabilities of a Dauntless in a fight with a Zero. One of the many nicknames that the plane got was the Furious D. Oh, no, I can't seem to move to the next slide. No, there I can. What we see there is in SBD 5. We'll be going through the models. This was the most produced of all the Dauntlesses. Very clean lines and an awesome, all-round awesome aircraft. So the Dauntless played one of the most significant roles in the course of World War II. The nickname given to it by its crews, it's slow but deadly, obviously a play on the SBD, which was Scout Bomber Douglas. Serving throughout the war, the Dauntlesses would sink more than 300,000 tons of enemy shipping, including at least 18 warships, that's ranging from submarines to battleships. And during 1942, the Dauntless were the primary weapon in the US war effort in the Pacific, and it almost single-handedly sank 6 enemy carriers. Now, the Navy, that's the US Navy experience with dive bombing, went back to the early years of naval aviation. The United States Marine Corps pilots, they had experienced with this technique as early as 1919, although it was not known by that name at the time. So with the commissioning of the first carrier, the USS Langley, the Navy realized there would be limitations to the size of aircraft used at sea, and carrier planes could not hope to carry the same bomb load as shore-based aircraft, so they needed to be able to deliver each bomb more accurately than what you would with a ground-based bomber, where you could carpet bomb. You didn't have the luxury in the Navy to carpet bomb. You had to put that bomb at the spot where you were aiming at, and dive bombing was the answer at the time. So this technique gained official status, and then in 1926, when the Navy included it in field exercises, fleet exercises. And then they had accidents involving the bomb hitting the propeller or the wheels on the release, and that almost ended the use of this new type of delivery. So a solution was found in a bomb fork, which swung the bomb clear of the propeller arc, and the approval for that then followed in 1931. Now there we can see this thing, I don't know, can you see my arrow, my cursor when I show? It's obviously a little
yeah, we can
see. Okay.
Yeah, yes.
Spring mechanism there. The fins would keep the bomb in sort of, flying almost. So you won't have the bomb, the nose and the tail differing. It would swing it down, this whole contraption swing down and release the bomb. As you can see there, this drawing doesn't really, it shows this frame up again, but it would be down and swung the bomb clear of that propeller arc. This is an SBD-1, as you can see from the big radiator intake there. You had the telescopic sight still on that, and the R1820-32 engine at 1,000 horsepower, but we will go into more detail as we go on. This was obviously in a very early, before December 41, before the Japanese attack. This was the color scheme that American carrier planes carried, and that included the Wildcats. I've got the Dauntless and the Wildcat in this color scheme as models. Now, in 1934, the Bureau of Aeronautics held a design competition for a new generation of carrier plane, and the Navy wished to replace its 4 main types, which was a fighter, a scout plane, or scout bomber plane, torpedo bomber, and a dive bomber. And they wanted to replace it with all metal monoplane designs. And designs by Vought, Brewster, and Northrop were chosen for further development in the scout dive bomber category. And although the plane chosen was the Brewster, the company was focusing on building the Brewster Buffalo, and they lacked the facilities to meet the Navy's need. And only 30 of those SBN planes were built. The Vought design did not meet the performance, and even though they did not meet it, there was still an order for 50 planes, which was ordered as the SB2U Vindicator. There's a picture of the Vindicator. It sort of looks sluggish compared to the Dauntless. I would say that the drag on this plane was probably the reason why it didn't match the performance of the Dauntless. That is the Brewster. Very funny looking aircraft. I think if the wheels retracted, it probably had some performance, but yeah, was the chosen one, but didn't get produced. Now, the Northrop entry bore a family resemblance to the firm's Alpha series of mailplane aircraft, and the chief engineer there was Ed Heinemann, a very well-known aircraft designer who went on to design plenty more Northrop aircraft and Douglas aircraft. Sorry, not Northrop, but Douglas aircraft. And they had this racy low-wing monoplane design, incorporated many of the revolutionary construction techniques used in the earlier aircraft. So unlike the Vought entry, the XBT-1, as the Northrop aircraft was designated, in an effort to save weight, did not include folding wings. The split dive flaps on the trailing edge of the wings, which were perforated, eliminate the tail buffeting, and you can imagine going straight down at 270 knots. You needed that kind of help to, and we're getting to that further in the presentation, the tail buffeting and keeping that plane aligned with your target. So the Navy approved that design, and they ordered 54 production models designated as the BT-1. Now, here's something interesting that I've picked up. Northrop, one of the advantages of the wings that he used was it was called the multicellular stress skin construction, where there was no main support beam and the ribs, and they were replaced with dozens of metal boxes that was riveted together like a honeycomb, which gave it redundant strength and is not dependent on any one member. So this is also used in the DC-2, DC-3, and multiple other Northrop and Douglas aircraft from that point on. He was quite a clever guy. Part of this was Ed Heinemann said in a talk that Northrop Jack came up to him and said, "Listen, if we're building for the Navy, the plane needs to be rugged. It needs to be strong because it's going to be manhandled, and that's going to be the make or break of an aircraft in the Navy. It needs to handle carrier landings and enemy fire." That was the plane. The mail plane looks a bit like a racer. It could carry 6 passengers and the pilot. Here's a picture of a real one. It's a bit out of focus, but pixelated from, it was a smaller picture, I think. But still a mean-looking aircraft. But the BT-1, however, had stability problems, and with the 825 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine, it was underpowered. So the second prototype was called the XBT-2, was fitted with a new 1,000 horsepower Curtiss Wright R1820, which boosted that top speed of 212 by 35 miles per hour. The addition was a modified rudder, corrected the poor lateral stability, and then the fully retractable landing gear was also included on the new prototype. The new design then featured improved stability and low-speed control. That's the BT-1 in the picture. Let's have a quick look quickly at the Cyclone. The engine, this is developed. The range was from the R1820-04, which had 700 horsepower, eventually to the R1820 G205A, which developed 1,200 horsepower, and they were used. This engine was used in the Flying Fortress, in the Curtiss Hawk, DC-3, Dauntless, Wildcat, amongst others. There's a range of aircraft, and this was one of the successful engines of the Second World War. I'm not going to go into too much technical discussion of engines and airframe. I think guys like John and them are better equipped to really dive deep into what these engines could do. So this R1820 Cyclone 9 was represented the development of the Wright P2 engine that dated back to 1925. It had a greater displacement of 29.8 liters and a host of other improvements. It entered production in 1931, and just to show you what a good engine it was, remained in production well into the 1950s. It was a 9-cylinder, single-row supercharged air-cooled radial, driven it had a single-speed General Electric centrifugal type supercharger, and the eventual development went into the R2600, which was also a known engine. So during the development of the XBD2, Douglas took over the Northrop contract, and many Northrop employees, including Ed Heinemann, moved over with the project. And in 1938, Northrop sold his El Segundo factory in California to Douglas. With the switch in manufacturing, the XBD2 became the SBD1 for experimental Scout Bomber Douglas. And after some minor modifications, the Navy ordered 144 SBDs in April of 1939. In common with other Douglas aircraft whose names began with the letter D, the SBD was named the Dauntless then. And there you can see the XBD2 at the top and the SBD at the bottom. So although the Navy had placed the order, it did not consider the SBD-1 to be fully combat ready. And the main problem was a lack of fuel capacity, which limited the range of the Dauntless. So with the amount of time spent forming up and landing on a carrier, fuel capacity was considered critical. And Douglas agreed to address the problem. Beginning with the 58th production model, the Navy agreed to accept the first 57 SBDs without modification and decided that the Marines, who mostly operated from land bases, could use these aircraft. The Marines therefore received the first Dauntlesses in June of 1940. Now that we can see the SBD-1, we can see the big intake, carburetor air intake over the nose. The remaining 87 aircraft of that original contract were then delivered as SBD-2s. So while the modifications of this version did not solve all the problems, they did improve on the lack of range. In this model, the two small 15-gallon auxiliary fuel tanks located in the wing center section were replaced with two 65-gallon tanks in the outer wings. So fuel capacity was increased from 210 to 310 gallons, increasing the range to 1,200 miles. The SBD-2 also had an autopilot for the long overwater flights that were now possible. This increased weight hurt the performance, and often one of the two 50 caliber fuselage mounted guns would be removed to compensate. So deliveries of the SBD-2 to VS-2 and VB, that will be Scout and Bomber 2 on board the Lexington, began in November 1940, with the Enterprises VS-6 and VB-6 following shortly after that. Now there's the SBD-2, and you can see that the carburetor air scoop has now been lowered. And unfortunately, this picture got cut off, but there's the auxiliary fuel, the additional fuel tanks in the outer wings, which was added. So the initial two models of the Dauntless would see the first combat in the Pacific on the 7th of December 1941 during the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the Marine Air Group 11, which was equipped with SBD-1s, was caught on the ground, and all the aircraft were either damaged or destroyed by the Japanese. At the same time, 18 Navy SBD-2s launched from the Enterprise, which was returning to Hawaii from Wake Island, arrived just as the Japanese were attacking. 7 of these Dauntlesses were shot down or crash landed, and 2 Japanese aircraft were claimed shot down by the Dauntlesses. 3 days later, the SBD gained the distinction of destroying the first Japanese warship of World War II, when Lieutenant Dickinson of VS6 sank the Imperial Japanese submarine, the I-70, off of Hawaii. As 1942 began, it was obvious that any retaliation for Pearl Harbor would have to come from the carrier forces, which had been at sea during the attack and had therefore avoided the destruction. The first action took the form of hit-and-run raids by the carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown against remote Japanese positions in the spring of 1942. And while these raids caused little damage, they served notice that the US Navy was still fighting. The Dauntlesses were heavily involved and attacked many ships and shore installations in these raids. One of the most famous strikes of this period was the Doolittle raid in Tokyo. The SBDs were out scouting and reported the Japanese picket boat ahead of the task force. And the Dauntless crew also reported that the boat had probably sighted them, and that precipitated the early launch of Doolittle's bombers. So deliveries of the new SBD-3 began in March of 1941 and were stepped up after the attack on Pearl Harbor, so that this was the main type to be used throughout the major battles of 1942. The SBD-3 brought the Dauntless up to full combat standards. It had self-sealing wing tanks, crew armor, and improved windscreen was all introduced. And the experience gained in the Battle of the Coral Sea prompted the introduction of a twin 30 caliber machine gun in the rear cockpit, increasing the rearward firepower. And we'll have a look at that further on as well. They were made standard in mid-production, and the earlier examples of the SBD-3 were retrofitted with the guns in the field. The added weight of these improvements was offset to a certain extent by the use of all-clad that replaced the duraluminum skin on the earlier models, and the removal of the flotation equipment, which was standard in the SBD-2. So the maximum speed fell by a small margin to 250 miles per hour, and this model was tongue-in-cheek nicknamed the Speedy 3, the SBD-3. The service ceiling on this plane, however, improved from 26 to 27,100 feet. Now there's the SBD-3, where the emergency flotation gear was removed, and also the sliding tab was added over additional cutouts for the double machine guns that was fitted to this SBD-2. In May of 1942, the US faced its first major operation against the Japanese fleet at the Battle of the Coral Sea. This battle resulted when Admiral Nimitz sent the Yorktown and the Lexington to block the Japanese thrust towards Australia. In this, the world's first carrier duel, in which the opposing ships never came within sight of each other, the Dauntlesses were responsible for sinking the Japanese small carrier, the Showa. Despite the fact that the Japanese sank the larger US fleet carrier, the Lexington, the battle was still considered a strategic victory for the Americans because they stopped the Japanese move to the south. And in less than a month's time, the Dauntlesses would improve on the Coral Sea performance, which it just had. With the failure of the southern expedition, the Japanese decided to strike at the US base at Midway. The plan was to gain a base from where they could threaten the Hawaiian Islands and thus draw the remaining carriers out to be destroyed in a major fleet engagement. They obviously was emboldened after sinking the Lexington, and the US Navy had an advantage in that they had broken the Japanese code and they knew the attack was coming. Also, the Japanese did not realize that the Yorktown, which had been damaged and believed sunk at Coral Sea, had been hastily repaired and was able to join the Enterprise and the Hornet at Midway. The three US carriers carried 112 Dauntlesses between them. Most were the latest SBD-3 model, but there were still a few 1s and 2s on board. And while the Navy had a much larger fleet, the sides were more evenly matched in the crucial area of air power. The Japanese had four, sorry, I just want to stop something here. The Japanese had four aircraft carriers, and the US had 3 carriers and the land-based aircraft at Midway, which included 19 SBD-2s. I've got, sorry, I was just looking to the side here. Siri on my phone was listening to every word and reacting. So by June the 3rd, the American carriers were then ready and had spotted the enemy troop transports. And the next day, the Japanese opened the battle with a strike on Midway. Meanwhile, Catalina had spotted the Japanese fleet and the US carriers began to launch the aircraft. And because of the varying launch times and speeds of the different aircraft, the TBD torpedo planes were the first to attack the Japanese carriers. They were torpedo bomber, torpedo planes, slow devastators. They were easy targets for the fighters, and they were soon beaten back with no damage to the carriers. And the reason for this was the uncoordinated nature of the attack. The SBD squadrons had in trouble finding the carriers. The Hornets SBDs never found the carriers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commander of the Enterprises Air Group, he made a navigational guess that brought his VS-6 and VB-6 right over the Japanese carriers. So while the devastators drawn down the Japanese fighter screens, all those heroes were at ground level or at low level fighting the torpedo planes. And the Dauntlesses then found their targets wide open. The Japanese indecision as to whether to launch further strikes on the island or to attack the recently discovered carriers left bombs and torpedoes along with aviation fuel scattered on the carriers' decks, and at the same time as the McCluskey group attacked, VB-3 from the Yorktown arrived. Now, the combined onslaught rained 39 bombs on 3 Japanese carriers in 3 to 4 minutes, and 11 direct hits that mortally damaged the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soraya. The 4th carrier, the Hirayo, was located later and was also sunk by Dauntlesses. So Japan lost 4 carriers and many of its experienced aviators for the loss of 35 Dauntlesses from the 6 Navy and 1 Marine squadrons engaged. So the SBD had stopped the Japanese and allowed the US to fight on an equal footing in the Pacific. Now, the Dauntless would also play a significant part in the first major American offensive. That was the fight for Guadalcanal. The Marine SBDs based on the island attacked Japanese ships, which were known as the Tokyo Express, that were attempting to reinforce the island. And ship-based SBDs also participated in the Eastern Solomons campaign, of which Guadalcanal was a part, and sank another Japanese carrier. So while the SBD is most often associated with the Pacific Theater of Operations, it did serve in a limited capacity in the Atlantic as well. In November 42, Dauntlesses flew from the carrier Ranger and from the escort carriers Sangamon and Santee in support of Operation Torch. Now, the invasion of North Africa was obviously called Torch. In contrast with the naval actions of the Pacific, the SBD attacks were mostly against ground targets in support of the Allied landings. They were, however, called upon to attack 7 Vichy French cruisers that set out to attack the Allied troop ships. So on November the 10th, 9 SBDs from the Ranger sank the moored battleship Jean Bart, which had been firing on the invasion fleet. So with the sinking of the Japanese battleship Hiei in the Pacific 3 days earlier, I don't know how I pronounced that, but this was the second enemy battleship sunk by Dauntlesses within 1 week. The SBDs from Santee also, now remember the Santee and those others were smaller battleships converted to small carriers. They also conducted anti-submarine patrols in the Atlantic during 43, but the Avenger was better suited for that longer range and was used more often for this type of work. So the Marine Dauntlesses operated in the patrol and the scouting role from the Virgin Islands until mid-1944. The last offensive missions for the Dauntless in the Atlantic was an attack on enemy shipping in Norway called Operation Leader. The SBDs from the carrier Ranger attacked several ships in Bodo Harbor and Roadstead. They sank 2 ships and they shared in the destruction of 2 more and damaged a further 2. Now, Douglas continued to modify the Dauntless throughout the war in an attempt to improve the performance. SBD-4 was introduced in late 1942. It now had a 24-volt electrical system that allowed for radar installation. It also featured the Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller, but at 245 miles per hour maximum speed, this was also the slowest version in the end. Early in 43, the SBD-5 with a larger engine started to enter squadron service. 2 additions that increased bombing accuracy were the replacement of the telescopic sight of the early models with a reflector sight, and of course a heated windscreen, which overcame the fogging that had been common in the dive run. Radar was also more commonly seen on this model. Now, the additional weight of the extra equipment largely cancelled out the increased horsepower. Now you can see the SBD4 had the new propeller, the rest basically the same. The SBD5 was the most produced variant of the Dauntless and served throughout the battles of 1943. The last version of the Dauntless, the SBD6, featured the larger engine, which raised top speed to 262 miles per hour and the service ceiling to 28,600 feet. And in all other ways, however, it differed little from the previous models. By the time it entered production, the Helldiver was replacing the Dauntless in the fleet, and the SBD6 remained for the most part stateside. Now the SBD5 with the reflector sight. Now here's the big difference you can see from the SBD4 to the SBD5. The engine and its Naka cowling was moved forward. And you can see the contour of the cowling. This was to incorporate the slightly larger engine that was fitted to the SBD5. Now here we can have a comparative look at the models as they developed throughout the war, the 1942, 43, 44 period. The first SBD-1s disappointed, given to the Marines. They got 57 planes, 1940. Bomb load never changed. Gross weight increased by about 1,000 pounds. The bomb sight changed from a 3-power telescope to a reflector. The pilot guns never changed. Well, it went from a .3 caliber to the .5 caliber in the SBD3. The rear gun became two .3 calibers. The engine was the 1820-32 to the 1820-52 to the 1820-60 and ultimately the 66. So horsepower up from 1,000 to 1,350. Top speed marginally increasing, and cruising speed virtually the same throughout this period. Now the Dauntless, just as a comparison, the contemporaries, the planes that you could measure them against, which we will now, is the Aichi D3 Vel, the Stuka, or sorry, Marais, the Junkers 87, and then the Blackburn Skua. So once again, interesting. I think out of the four of them, the plane that looks on paper more impressive is the Aichi Vel. It had the same wings length and slightly longer wingspan. But it was significantly faster than the rest. It could climb significantly higher, and it had only 840-mile range there. That was the downfall, I would think, for it. But forward guns as well, that's where it lacked. It was .303, that's a 7.6 millimeter, where the Stuka had 0.31 inch. The Dauntless then ultimately had 0.5 calibers. And then when you look at the kind of, the Blackburn Skua was the only, I just thought I was going to take one from each of the major countries that participated, the Japanese, the Germans, the Americans, and the British. When you look at that bomb load, that's where the Dauntless really came into its own. It could take a ton of bombs. The Skua can take 500 kilograms. The Stuka could take 450 kgs, and then the Vel obviously a very light load, which probably helped the top speed quite a bit. Now by June in 1943, the US Navy had 4 large, the Essex class carriers. The Helldiver was supposed to be the dive bomber assigned to the new carriers, but in the summer of 43, it was not ready for combat yet. So the Dauntless is therefore soldiered on. Its role on the new carriers changed, however. The new CVs could carry 100 planes compared to 80 on the older carriers, and the scout squadrons were eliminated. The difference in airplanes was made up by an increase in the number of fighters. So the scout duties were now taken over by Hellcats and Avengers, both of which had long-range capabilities. From then on, the Dauntless would serve almost exclusively as a strike aircraft. The SBDs continued to fly throughout 1943, and not until late in the year did the SB-2C Helldiver finally enter service. Many pilots, Navy pilots, did not see the Helldiver as much of an improvement over the Dauntless. The pilots preferred the SBD's more responsive controls, which made it an easy plane to fly when lightly loaded, and the Douglas aircraft also required less maintenance hours than did the Helldiver. So despite the introduction of the Helldiver, the Dauntless has continued in Navy service until July 44, when they participated in their last mission during the attack on Guam. And the Marines continued to use them in the Philippines campaign. And by the end of World War II, most Dauntlesses had been relegated to the training and utility roles. A few Marine SBDs, however, were still at work, neutralizing bypass garrisons in the Solomons until the end of the war. Now, the Dauntless was not only used by the US Navy, but also by the Army. So the success of German dive bombers during the early years of the war with the Blitzkrieg convinced some Army leaders of the need of a US version. So they had limited experience with type of aircraft and no time to develop a new design. But dictated it was dictated that the United States Army Air Force placed orders for the Navy SBDs. In Army service, it was known as the A-24 Banshee. Now, the main difference with the Dauntless was the lack of a tailhook, and of course a larger pneumatic tail wheel. The Banshee was delivered as the A-24, A-24A, and A-24B, which were equivalent to the SBD 3, 4, and 5. So they got the later models. The idea of dive bombing was not widely supported in the US Army Air Forces, and the Banshee was not used extensively. So in addition to the United States, New Zealand in the Solomons, and the Free French in Europe also flew SBDs. As late as 1949, the French were using SBDs to carry out attacks on communist terrorists in Indochina. Mexico flew some Banshees, which it had received for patrol missions in the Gulf of Mexico during World War II. They used them as border patrol planes until 1959. Now, this old picture, it's a US Navy Scout Bomber Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, likely from Carrier Air Group 4, VS-41, the top hatters, using a road as a makeshift runway near Safi in Morocco in November of 42. The historic port, about 140 nautical miles south of Casablanca, had been captured just hours before by 3 World War I era US Navy destroyers carrying a raiding force of light infantry in the opening move of Operation Torch, which was the invasion of French North Africa. If you remember correctly, you should all know that while the British were fighting in the desert up to Tunisia, through Libya, Tunisia, the Americans landed on the west coast, and that's how they managed to get old Rommel out of Africa. Now, you'll note the special insignia, a white yellow circle around the regular star and circle emblem, which predated the invasion stripes of D-Day. So, like I said, the plane was probably from the Rangers CV4, who for the torch landings at 18 such aircraft in VS-41. Another 18 SBDs were carried, 9 each, on 2 escort carriers, the Sangamon and the Santee. The SBDs from Ranger, besides proving their worth plastering land-based targets, had also socked the French battleship Jean Bart on 10th November 42 in Casablanca with a pair of 1,000-pound bombs, that's 500-kilogram bombs, finishing but the USS Massachusetts had started. 2 other escort carriers took part in the torch landings but did not carry SBDs, the Suwannee, 29 Wildcats and 9 TBFs, and the USS Chenango, a load of 76 Army P-40s on a one-way trip. Now, next up, I think we can have a look at some nice pictures of the Dauntless. Maybe look at some of the things that we discussed. You can see there's the underwing bomb mount there. There's the swing arm for the center section bomb. Now, this is how the attack of the Dauntless worked. They normally cruised at between 18 and 20,000 feet. So after sighting the target, they would increase speed and descend to 8,000 feet. Then when the target disappeared under the nose, and the pilot had through his feet had a little sight to see where the plane, the target is below them. The plane would dip over in a 70-degree dive. That dive would be 30 to 40 seconds of pure hell, I'm sure, under constant fire. Bomb release at 2,000 feet. Anything below 2,000 feet, anything below, well, if you release at 2,000 feet, you pull out the 4G pull, you will clear at about 1,200 feet. The explosion, the debris from that bomb explosion could go as high as 500 feet. So you need to be, you could go 600 feet lower and just make it, but then you'll be pulling 7, 8, 9 Gs even. And this plane was strong enough to handle 9 Gs, which has been recorded in the Dauntless. So but between 2,000 feet and say 1,000, yeah, 1,200. No, you won't really go to 1,200 feet, but say 1,500 feet. Your pull-out Gs would be significantly higher than the one demonstrated in the picture. Yeah. There's a beautiful picture of those dive flaps at the bottom all the way through. At the top, only on the wings for landing, and takeoff. The top part would not extend, only the bottom. There's a nice picture of an SBD going into that power dive on the boat. And the Japanese were very friendly. They painted a bullseye on their planes, on their carriers, which obviously helped the guys in attacking. You can see that rear gunner, he's probably weightless and pulling on the straps at that point. And imagine all the debris in the cockpit is now floating around while they're doing this dive. Nice picture of a number of planes. I would imagine this would be a training flight. There's no bombs attached. Another one, actual war picture. There's an SBD over, I think it's the Yorktown, if I'm not mistaken. We're now 40 minutes in, Carl, shall we take a quick pause?
Jannie, thank you. Yes, I think we do. Let's take, the time is now